So I have a question for everyone in the room. How many of you have deployed or are thinking of deploying SharePoint as a centralized service within your organization? All right, that's a good sign because it's exactly the people I want to talk to. My name is Scott Jameson. I'm with a company called Jornada out of Boston. We're a SharePoint Microsoft partner. And I'm being joined this morning by Christoph from the product team right here. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone.
And what I'm going to be talking about, actually, Christoph and I together will be talking about is thinking about SharePoint and SharePoint governance with a particular focus, which is once you actually deploy SharePoint as a central service, then how do you keep up with demand requests from the business units, right? The lines of business, business users, et cetera, for all the things you can build on top of SharePoint. And you have to manage those effectively so they don't collide, and you have a great project schedule, and you have to figure out, do I have enough resources? Do I have to go external? All that stuff. So I'm going to talk about that now, and feel free to jump in with your questions.
So I've actually, I'm giving an end-user talk in the fish bowl out in the expo hall, and I'm going to give away a copy of my SharePoint 2010 book. It talks a lot about governance and some of the things you need to do, so feel free to stop by later today. All right, so specifically, we'll go through 4 key points here. We're going to review the IT challenges of managing SharePoint as a central service a little bit, and then assess what the options are for collecting these requests from users, for managing them, for making the decision-making process around application lifecycle management. So traditionally, if you build an application for a business line, and you use Visual Studio and SQL and you build it yourself, there's an application development lifecycle that happens, right? And there's some kind of change management process that happens. And a lot of folks that I talk to in organizations, especially larger organizations, are trying to get a grip on how do you actually do that with SharePoint. So this is essentially what we're going to do is we're actually today at TechEd Live, because you guys are here, we're actually announcing a new solution starter that's going to be that's actually already available out on the web, and I just tweeted about it 4 minutes ago. So if you're following Twitter, I'm SJAM, so if you want to see the link. And essentially, there's a couple of white papers. There's guidance around how to configure this solution. And at the end of this, feel free to go download it and try it out. All right, so why do companies choose SharePoint in the first place? I hear SharePoint's starting to catch on. Right? It's something like 20 billion licenses, or I can't even keep up with it. Maybe not that many, but you get the idea that there's a lot of good reasons for SharePoint. The main one is it's a flexible and easy way to create applications quickly for the business, right? There's collaborative apps and search and workflow and all these different things you can build, and it's catching on as a great way to replace, for example, desktop access apps or Excel or my favorite application for all the applications that haven't been written yet, which is called email, right? And so SharePoint is replacing those slowly over time. And what you end up with is business empowerment with self-service applications. The funny thing about self-service applications is there's a wide range of things you can actually do from a self-service perspective. And some of these truly aren't self-service. What they are is it actually enables IT to build the business application faster, right? And there's a common platform to build it on. And we'll talk about which ones are kind of self-service, truly, and which ones are more, hey, IT, can you build this for me? Or, hey, IT, I'm going to go work with the solution partner, and can you help me get it installed, right? So there's a varying mix of kind of what those look like. So we're seeing a trend toward SharePoint being or becoming sort of the quote-unquote central service platform for a lot of these new business requests, right? So if we're going to build something for the business that's not our ERP system or our CRM system, but sort of wants to solve the other problems around collaboration and enabling visibility into certain things, line of business, visualizing data somehow, right? SharePoint's a great tool for a lot of these things, collaboration, et cetera. So let's talk briefly about what those applications, those business applications that actually will sit on top of SharePoint might look like, right? So I've broken them up into 3 categories. There might even be 4 if I include sort of help desk items on here.
but for this discussion, we'll just call it 3 for now. So self-service, right? True self-service, minor project, major project, right? So let's say, for example, fast forward in time, or maybe you've already done this, you've got SharePoint out there as a central service. And now you're raising your SharePoint maturity a little bit, right? In that you're coming up with a great way for businesses to then request new functionality in the SharePoint environment. And you want to think about that because you don't just want to throw SharePoint out there and say, hey, it's a free-for-all, go nuts. Because Service Pack 1 was just announced this week at TechEd for SharePoint. What happens when you deploy Service Pack 1 on a central environment? Well, there might be business applications that haven't been tested with Service Pack 1 yet. Well, what's the plan to regression test those business applications? Again, if you're not thinking about that and making sure that happens, that means your SharePoint maturity level is probably not as high as it should be for having a central offering in SharePoint in the first place. All right, so what do some of these things look like? Well, self-service. Well, I can go to the business user and say, do these yourself. You want to create a sub-site under your site collection that we gave you? Hey, go ahead. You just bump up against your quota one of these days, and we don't care. Just build stuff. That's what it's there for, right? Creating pages, of course, that's the whole point, is I don't need a webmaster. I can go out there and create them myself. Page edits, new lists, content query web part changes. These are all things that are supposed to be enabling the business user to create their own applications, right? So there's going to be a class of business applications that are truly self-service. IT puts the platform out there, and the business just runs with the ball. They create new web parts and lists and pages, and they move it all around, and they love it, and they're building something really cool. But what's interesting is you still need a process for making sure those things live a long life when you either upgrade SharePoint with a major version or add a service pack or something like that. But I'm going to call these things very small because an end user can directly do them in a matter of minutes or maybe hours or maybe days, depending on what it is, right? But there are other things that sort of sound like they're self-service, but really IT's probably going to get involved. Like, hey, I want a new site collection. Now, even though you can enable this in SharePoint, pretty much 98% of the customers I talk to, especially large organizations, say, we have a process in place by which you request a site collection, we'll create it and give it to you. So no self-service site creation, although you could enable that, right? So that could go in the first column. But right now, we're going to call it an IT minor project. And it's pretty minor because it's probably only a few steps to create that and maybe a few steps of approval in a workflow or something. And maybe there's some kind of site template creation or a selection process or something like that. But then it starts to get a little bit hairier when maybe the business says, hey, we had this vendor over here, this solution partner, build something for us in SharePoint. Can you guys deploy it to the central farm? And that might be a bigger process because if you're not going to do a sandbox solution and you're deploying it to the server as a centrally hosted application, then it could affect other business apps or other functionality like the portal or something like that on your SharePoint farm. So you can't take that lightly. You got to make sure it's well tested, etc. So by the way, restore deleted site. That's also something that users will still have to request. But the nice thing was with Service Pack 1, IT will now be able to do that pretty much automatically instead of having to restore from backup. That's one of the cool new features in SP1, by the way. Install third-party software. So I hear this all the time where the business says, hey, we want to build our own application, but we need this third-party tool, probably from one of the vendors that are out at the expo hall right now. IT, can you install this? Because it'll give me a bunch of web parts that I can then build my own apps. Again, that's all well and good, but that has to be well tested and make sure it doesn't break something else, or you want to figure out the supportability for an upgrade in the future and regression testing for all the other business apps, et cetera, et cetera. And those are probably things that will take IT a matter of maybe days, maybe weeks. And so these are projects. They're just not huge projects, right? They're maybe a 2-3 week project or something like that, but it's still something that's going to take time and resources, and you're going to get back to the business with, yeah, we can do that, and here's the time frame. And then you've got big things, like the business says, hey, we want social tagging, and you're on 2007 right now. Well, now you got to upgrade to 2010, and that's a large undertaking, right? That's not going to be days or weeks. That's probably going to be a year or 6 months or something like that, right, before that's going to really happen. Or maybe the business says, hey, we want an executive dashboard. can you build that? And again, that could be a 6-month project to really build and define something useful there. So these are things that IT or maybe an outside vendor or something like that might take on, but these are probably months at a time. And what's interesting is if you're a large organization especially, and you put SharePoint out there, you could be getting dozens of these at any given moment because you've got maybe 8 lines of business and they're all requesting 2 or 3 things. That's 24 requests of your SharePoint team right there. How are you managing those? So let's talk about how would you manage that and what are the challenges of sort of managing each of these, right? So if you think about, what are the challenges with having a central service, right? Managing change in production. This is a big deal, right? Capturing proposals for new functionality. So let's say the business emails the SharePoint administrator and says, hey, Bob, can you install ChorusWorks for us? Okay, well, guess what? Bob should stop, take a deep breath, and think about what does that actually take. There's probably a specific project plan that they want to put in place for regression testing and upgrades and figuring out what the operational model for that thing is. Again, it's not something you just want to slap into production, especially if you have a central service for the organization for building apps. Prioritizing these. So let's say we do actually get 24 requests at the same time, which isn't uncommon. I actually talk to a lot of customers where they're getting a lot of business requests of all different sizes. How do you objectively rank those to make sure that you actually do the right ones for the right lines of business, right? Traditionally, how does it work? It's whoever screams the loudest or who happens to play golf with the CEO or something like that, right? And that's not objectively selecting the right projects to do in the SharePoint environment. Forecasting resource needs. So again, this is the funny part. I talk to customers and I say, so who's your SharePoint admin? Oh, well, our Exchange guy, he's just going to take over Exchange and SharePoint. Okay, so you haven't thought about any of the other 24 roles you need in the organization to manage SharePoint? And when I say 24 roles, I'm actually not kidding. I mean, we're talking who's monitoring search reports and then feeding that back in for keywords and best bets, right? That's a role. It doesn't mean you have to hire someone full-time. It's definitely not going to be the SharePoint admin that does that necessarily as their primary gig, but you want to think about that as a role, right? So who is that? Or, hey, we want to spin up 24 new applications that we're going to build on top of SharePoint. Great, how many developers do you have in the SharePoint IT team or the line of business? None? Okay, so where are the resources coming from? So how do you accurately, from an executive level, then forecast needs? And if you're in IT, tasked with managing SharePoint, the solution we're going to talk about today helps you build up ammunition and make a business case to say, look, there are all these requests coming in. We only have 2 people. We need 5. Here's the data to prove it. There you go. And so it's a nice business justification for you as well. Effectively managing selected projects. So once you figure out that you only have enough resources for 10 of the 24 projects, you still got to manage them, right? So a tool for actually managing the projects. Excel, Project Professional, something like that. We'll talk about that. And then, of course, once they're done, how do you figure out if it worked? And do you have to do follow-up? And how successful were they? And again, good reporting to management to say, look, I'm justifying those 3 new FTEs you hired for me, or you gave me a budget to hire. All right, so let's talk about the business self-service lifecycle, right? So if I think about an application lifecycle, typically there's, people have in mind what application lifecycle means. Let's talk about it in the context of SharePoint, because SharePoint kind of changes the game a little bit around applications, right? So let's take a real simple one, like one of those self-service things, like, hey, I need a new app, but I can kind of do it myself in a list and just drop those web parts on the page. So I have a business need. Great, I self-service create an application. I deploy it. And it gets supported for me. All good, right? The thing is, this definitely needs a governance model where you're providing guardrails for the business users so they're not doing anything too crazy, right? So you want to enforce through either policy or through actually technical features like enabling a quota or something like that, or shutting off certain web parts so that business users can't shoot themselves in the foot too badly, right? Because you want to enable that, give them that empowerment, but you need to make sure you do it in a way that makes sense. And by the way, if you are doing this and letting users build their own little applications in SharePoint, you've got to be a little bit careful, because if it's truly an application and over time it becomes business critical, then you need to know, as IT, you need to know about that application, because if you deploy, let's say, Service Pack 1 or something like that, how do you know which sites to regression test? And is the business signed up and willing to actually do that, right? Because they're going to say, hey, you broke my application. Well, no, you need to tell us that this is business critical, et cetera. OK, so what about the minor requests? Again, reasonably straightforward. The request comes into SharePoint's IT group. You review the request. Maybe it's a simple deployment. And then there's some supportability model that needs to happen, right? So it's a simple selection process, which is probably like, we'll just do them all, right? But how do you manage lots and lots of requests? Meaning, if you get a lot of these, then you can actually start running into resource requirements and actually conflicts. Of course, a major project is just like any major project, which is it's a bigger life cycle, right? You probably need to review the request. You need to get additional information from the business, because if they're saying, hey, I need an executive dashboard, well, there's probably a lot more to it, right? There's probably like, I got to build these cubes, and then I got to figure out who sees it and what the functionality is and all that stuff. And then even if I understand what it is, I have to make sure we select that for actual completion, because it could be a year-long project and cost me $500,000 to complete that project. Well, that's not a thing I could just consider lightly and say, yeah, sure, we'll do that for you, right? So if you take that life cycle, there's a few things to consider. Again, that selection process should have objective criteria and real thought, right? You're not just going to say, yeah, I guess I'll do this project and not that one. It also depends on your company maturity. So again, if you are truly going to offer SharePoint as a central service, especially for business applications over time, then you need to think about what should your process be for businesses to request things of the SharePoint team. You should also, when you select which projects to do, think about it in the context of your business priorities. And I know from an IT perspective, you're thinking, OK, I don't even know what the business priorities are. But that's where you work with the PMO or the executive team or whatever to say, what are you actually trying to do? So some sample ones that drive SharePoint projects for justification are things like, hey, when we deploy this SharePoint thing, we're going to have productivity gains, right? Everybody loves productivity gains. Or we'll get better employee retention because we're going to have these cool tools that the Gen Xers are going to love or Gen Yers are going to love. Maybe there's quality improvements because we're going to do better document management. There's time to market because we can get our application built faster and it's going to let us run this process that we're doing. Things like that. So if you look at that, you want to make sure when you manage the project itself, you want to make sure there's a place to store things, task tracking, resource tracking, et cetera. So it's starting to sound like, oh, I'd probably use something like project to manage the project anyway. So what we're going to show you then is the concept of, well, how do you track the requests and then track the project itself, right? So if you look at sort of any of these particular projects that you're going to do in SharePoint, it probably goes through some kind of 5-step process. And again, this is an example process. The process you have in your organization might be a little more complex or even simpler for that matter. But the idea is that you've got to have some way of capturing a business request, meaning the user says, hey, can we get a new business dashboard built? And how do we make that happen, right? And then you've got to look at all the projects that are coming in and say, OK, using objective criteria, how do we know which ones to pick given limited resources? And then once you pick them, you got to figure out who's going to do them. So that's a resource planning exercise. And do you have money to do it? And then you got to build the thing, right, and deploy it. And then maybe afterwards you want to assess whether it was complete. So this is the example that the solution that we've posted uses as an example workflow. And in order to make it clear, this is an example that you can change, right? This is just a sample that is the most likely scenario for SharePoint requests that come in. All right, so how do you manage business requests? Well, again, if you're a small organization or you don't have very many requests, you could probably just build something in SharePoint itself, right? You could store all your docs in a central repository in SharePoint. The requests that come in from the business, you can capture in a list probably, right? But what I'm stressing here is make sure you have some place to capture the business requests, and you're not just doing it over email willy-nilly, as small as those are, right? They should either go to the help desk if they're truly I have a bug kind of issue, or they should go into some kind of queue, because even though it looks like at the beginning, yeah, we get a request every once in a while, and Anne over there, she just handles it or whatever, but it's going to grow over time because more and more groups are going to start seeing the value of it, and they're going to request more and more. So you want to be ahead of the curve from a request management perspective. So once you've captured the request, how do you run the project, right? Well, again, project professional, something like that, works really well, where you have tasks, schedule assignments, you can do resourcing and things like that. You can have team members update their status, whatever. So this is great because you can give the business a clear picture of where you are, right? But what if you want to combine those two and have a much better way to manage all this stuff, right? Project Server, which sits on top of SharePoint, right, has a great built-in functionality that we've just customized for this solution a little bit. I mean, we did a no-code solution that Christoph will talk about, that all we did was we took the great features of Project that sits on top of SharePoint, and we just tweaked a few things here and there so that it enabled a SharePoint request system that you can manage requests. So what does it do? Create and manage the portfolio of requests that come in for SharePoint in one place. Be able to consistently evaluate those using real metrics. Provide a graphical dashboard for where you are in SharePoint projects. And then basically what you're doing is you're managing effectively the life cycle from end to end rather than jumping all over the place, and you actually can have a consistent set of metrics and tools for managing all these requests. Okay, so why are we using SharePoint and Project, right? So if you look at SharePoint, folks in here, I'm assuming, are very familiar with SharePoint, right? If you look at the capabilities that are in SharePoint that we're going to use to build those business applications, there are things like content management and security and site creation, security management I mentioned, search features, BI features. These are actually the same features, those are the features that we're going to build our business apps on top of SharePoint with. Those are the same features that Project Server leverages to do its management of data and its BI, et cetera, right? So it's nice that it's a solution built right on top of SharePoint. And there's a lot of things that are going to be perfect features for us to track and measure these requests throughout the life cycle of that SharePoint solution. Things like demand management. So that means what requests are coming in and where are they coming from, and I want to start evaluating those, right? And that leads to portfolio selection up in the upper right-hand corner. Portfolio selection just means I have these 20 or 30 requests coming in. Which ones do I do, and in what order do I do them, and do I have the right resources, right? Which leads us to resource management. I can actually predictably figure out what my SharePoint team is doing, and do I need to hire more people? Schedule management, when are we going to deliver? Team collaboration, again, once I get the project spun up, Project Server is actually using the infrastructure in SharePoint, like team sites and things like that. So these are project sites that actually help us manage the artifacts for the project itself. And then there's reporting that comes out of it to help us figure out which projects were done and successful and all that stuff, right? So it's a great complement to the SharePoint infrastructure we're putting in place to build applications itself. And the nice thing about Project and SharePoint is that there's a lot of great integration with tools you already have that are actually built into or work with SharePoint closely, right? So you have Office, you have a connection from Project into Dynamics. There's a lot of nice synchronization and feature integration there. So we'd like to officially announce this solution that you can download as soon as you leave the session if you're interested in it. And even if you're not interested in trying out the solution, there's actually 2 white papers that I want to talk about. And I'll talk about that in a second. I'll tell you which one to read first. But basically, this is a no-code solution and guidance for managing SharePoint business requests that we're putting out there. And it's essentially, the guidance comes in 2 forms, 2 white papers. So the first one is essentially a business decision maker or technical decision maker white paper that describes the business solution and the benefits. So if anything, if you go to the site, I would actually download that one first and read it through. And it's actually an interesting read to talk about why the solution is actually beneficial for SharePoint governance in a central model for managing requests that come from the business. And then if you're actually not convinced, then you can put that white paper down and go on your business, right? But if you are interested, there's another white paper that actually takes you through step-by-step of how to configure the solution. And again, the nice thing is it's no code, so you can actually just configure it directly in project, which is a great way to at least kick the tires on something maybe you've considered so far kicking the tires on, and this is maybe a great way to start doing that. We've also posted a content database, or specifically a 5-content database zip file, and it actually has a bunch of sample data that Christoph's actually going to use in his demo. So the same data that you'll see here in the demo is actually in that 5 database solution, and that's so that you don't have a blank thing to work with in case you just want to kind of play with it, right, from a demo perspective, or you want to show somebody. And you can actually use that as a configurable starting point if you want to go further from there. So essentially, the way you'd use this is, first off, before you even do this, so read the white paper, but before you try to implement it, make sure your SharePoint maturity level, and I use those words, is kind of up to speed enough or up to snuff enough to make sure you're thinking about, okay, do we even need a tool yet? Or do we really need to have our process kind of defined on a whiteboard first, have buy-in from everybody about, okay, what's the agreement between the business and the SharePoint IT team about how this whole thing's going to work? Like, when you request an app, here's the process we're going to use. So the nice thing is, you can look all smart that you came up with a process to manage all the requests, right? Hey, look, this is the process we're going to use. This is how we're going to evaluate which requests we're going to do. So you can either deploy it yourself, you can engage a partner to help you out if you like it, all that stuff. We can talk about that later. And then it's available today. So it got posted yesterday. You can actually go to this link and check it out. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Christoph, who will actually take us through the solution itself and do a nice demo so you can actually see what the heck I'm talking about. So, Christoph?
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everyone. First, thank you very much for showing up. I know we're already at, I guess this is the 3rd day of TechEd, and it's always tough to attend those early sessions, so thanks for attending. And just to keep you awake, at the end, we do have a couple of giveaways, 16 gigabyte USB keys, so whoever's interested, feel free to come by at the end. So as Scott mentioned, let's show you what we're talking about in action. And just to frame a little bit before I jump into the demo, basically what we're going to be doing is walk through that life cycle of those typical requests you might get if some of you are managing SharePoint forms on a day-to-day basis. And basically, as Scott mentioned, the first step typically is a business user is going to ask you, if you're the administrator of the farm, can you do X in the farm? Then the next stage that I'm going to be playing, which is probably a different role, someone in IT gets the request, and they need to start evaluating that request. Maybe Christoph, the business user, say, deploy service pack 1. Well, whoever gets that request in IT says, what's the risk? What's the effort? What else do I need to worry about to handle this request? And then, as Scott mentioned, after I've kind of built a business case and whatever is my methodology to handle requests, then typically I'm going to hand that case for that change in the farm to maybe a committee within my IT org that's going to say, here's all the requests we get this quarter, or here's all the requests we get for the next year, and let's objectively evaluate all of them to make sure it fits our business constraints, whether it's cost constraints, whether it's resource constraints, and timing. And then hopefully at the end of that exercise, it could happen on a quarterly basis. It could happen, twice a year, once a year, especially for the large projects. Then I'm going to go, commit to that and pass the baton to whoever is going to be the project lead to handle this request. And I'm going to say, okay, you get the green light. Here's your budget. Here's your resources. Go ahead and execute. So, we're going to execute. We're going to build a plan, assign resources. Throughout that stage, we're going to start getting feedback from the resources. How's everyone doing on their list of to-dos? Are they 100% complete, 50% complete? Eventually, they'll be done with the project. And typically, the last step of this workflow is, let's do a post-mortem. Let's make sure we're closing that request. Let's make sure the business user that initiated the request is satisfied with the delivery. Is there any key learnings as IT that we should potentially leverage, in a knowledge base so that when the next request comes in, we're a little more efficient in terms of execution, in terms of estimation. So just two screenshots of the what I'm going to be demoing. So since I'll be doing a demo, I'll move right through. So this is what I'm going to be showing you in the demo. And this leads me into the demo. OK, so first thing is what you're looking at is Project Server 2010 or web app. So a very similar look and feel of the as SharePoint. We do have the ribbon in the web, et cetera, et cetera. So if you are not familiar, I've got a slide for later at the end of the deck. But if you want to see further demo of the project web app, feel free to swing by our project booth in the office exhibition hall, and we'll gladly have someone show you a little more in-depth demo of the capabilities of Project 2010. But sticking to the scenario, let's again pretend in this first role that I'm a business, part of a business unit as part of the Contoso organization, and I'm going to initiate a request. I'll get back to the screen. So in this case, I'm initiating the request within the web app, but you can easily maybe build an info path or leverage a SharePoint list to initiate the request. And Scott gave me a great hint, and which is timely with this week. But basically, I heard that the SharePoint 2010 Service Pack 1 is coming out, and so I think it's going to bring significant benefits to my organization, so I'm going to request that. IT, can you upgrade the form to Service Pack 1? So again, as the end user, I just have to put a name on the description. Now, all of this, as described in the paper, is configurable. So we're just showing you a way to start. There's by no means, if you want the business user to provide a lot more information to fill in 10 fields instead of 2, it's whatever is your processes on your methodology. Now, as soon as I hit submit, what happens in the back end is it initiated a workflow, which is some of the capabilities that come out of the box with Project Server 2010. And now what you're seeing now is kind of like this 5-stages workflow that I described earlier. So now, switch role, and let's pretend now it's Christoph, the IT person who's getting that funnel of all those requests from, let's say, everyone in the room. And I've got to enrich that request. Obviously, the business user doesn't have the expertise to evaluate, what's the technical impact, what's the effort, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the next stage that I've got to do is I got to gather additional information. I've got to build a business case on what does this request that I get from the business group entails. And what you're seeing here on the left-hand side is a series of pages that guides me through what do I need to provide to evaluate this request. And there's a couple things. Again, this is highly configurable, and this is just an example that we built for this example. But I got to provide an estimated cost. You got to provide effort, additional technical information, and potentially I got to give, based on my IT experience, what is in terms of my humble opinion, how risky is this request, and what type of SharePoint project type, meaning potentially, if I'm building a dashboard and I can slice and dice based on this type of request. So let's just put a cost. Let's just put $50,000 to apply Service Pack 1. Put 20 man days. I'll skip the description. And we'll put it medium risk. And I'll just select Other. So again, this is configurable. This is well described in the paper. I'm going to save this part. And all the fields that have the red asterisks, if I would have hit Save, if I'm trying to submit that workflow to go to the next stage, it'll kindly warn me that, Christoph, you cannot move on to the next stage because you haven't done all the homework and you're not following the procedure, meaning you haven't filled in all the required field. So I've enriched that request that I got from the business unit based on my IT experience on what is it going to take to handle this change request. And typically, the next thing I need to do, and it could be a colleague or the same person, is I need to start maybe thinking about, effort-wise, what is it going to take to apply this Service Pack 1 in my farm? Now, in Project 2010, that's also part of that solution star. You can automatically apply template to different type of requests. So this is what you're seeing here, just a simple template to get started. But what's more important at this stage is, we don't even know if we're going to do this request because it hasn't been committed yet, which is what I'll do later. But one thing I need to do to help that governance committee is, what do I think is going to be the effort to execute on this request? So in 2010, I go to this resource plan, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a high-level, top-down resource forecast of all the needs I think I need for this type of request. Again, think that you're in IT and you typically know what you've handled such requests in the past, and that's what I'm doing here. So basically, what I've added here, it's a little hard to read. I guess I can do a little zoom it. I've added standard roles that I've got in my organizations. Back to what Scott's saying, maybe I should have really 20 of those. But those are generic roles because at this stage, I don't care so much about who actually is going to be doing it, meaning Scott Jamison. What I need to do is kind of forecast the demand so that later on I can see, do I have the capacity to match that? So that's why, that's what we call typically generic resources. So I've added those as part of the plan, and then I'm going to do a quick estimate of each of those roles. So here, just to make it easier, I'm going to switch view and switch to FTE, and let's look at it on a monthly basis. And basically, to make this very easy, we're just going to request, let's say, a week worth of work of each one. And I'm just going to save this. So again, what I'm building is a high-level gut feeling based on past experience. What do I think, in my humble opinion, at the top-down level, what is the number of FTEs based by roles that I need to apply Service Pack 1? So let's close this resource forecast. The last thing I need to do, and back to what Scott was saying, is I need to also say, okay, applying Service Pack 1, how is that really aligned with what we say are key metrics for, let's say, the IT department, or more importantly, what are the key metrics for organizations? And what we mean by that, we call that strategic impact, but we came up with basically a list of drivers. And in this case, this is the drivers for the IT organizations, and the same drivers that Scott had in one of the slides earlier, which is applying Service Pack 1, is that going to help us with cost avoidance? So I need to start filling this form. Is that going to have a moderate impact, low, a strong, etc.? Is it going to help with employee retention? Well, maybe it's going to have a low impact. Is it going to help with productivity gain? Well, maybe yes. Based on some of the great new announcement that we made on what Service Pack 1 is going to have. Quality improvement, definitely, right? There's probably a bunch of bug fixes on hotfix on community update that roll into Service Pack 1. So hopefully it'll fix maybe some of the issues that I might have with the form today. So let's put a extreme. How risky is it to apply Service Pack 1? Well, there's some risk tied to it, as Scott mentioned. Maybe I need to do, it might break some custom solutions. So I'll put it strong, et cetera, return on investment. Again, this is just an example. But, you build a set of drivers, and, as the IT triaging those requests, I give him my humble opinion of what's the impact of this request, and how is that aligning with what we say we're going to do as a organization. So at this stage, step back. The end user submitted a request, apply Service Pack 1. Then I've looked at that request. I've kind of did a evaluation of that request. What is it going to take in terms of effort, in terms of resources asked? How does this request align with what we say we want to head, let's say, this next calendar year as an IT organization? And then I also build in additional data attributes as part of my process and methodology. So at this stage, I've done all the homework that I need to do to evaluate this request, and I'm going to submit the that package, that business case, to go to the next stage of the workflow. It's taking a couple seconds. Any questions so far? Yes?
Strategic impact, could that be separate? Let's say if the PMO had its own for global IT projects?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, the strategic impact, can you have different bundles of drivers per different department? Absolutely. And typically the way it works in 2010 is you can have a set of drivers, let's say for IT, a set of drivers for HR, a set of drivers for marketing, and sometimes you also have a set of drivers at the all up, shareholder value, customer satisfaction, expanding new markets. Those are overarching big bets that it's not just IT, everyone's on point for that. And typically, I'm not going to show too much in detail on the analysis, but you can do a pivot on how is this request aligns with the IT objective, or how is this request impacts IT and the all-up contoso.com overarching drivers. So you can mix and match, since you can do those analysis based on a specific department or department plus the all-up. So at this stage, again, I get that request. I'm part of the IT governance team, and it's telling me, I've submitted the request. Now, I've done my homework. What needs to happen next is someone in my org needs to approve, review that business case that I built, make sure it looks like make sure it follows the procedure, and then we're going to take it to the selection. So to do that, basically, Project Server 2010 is using the same approval workflow that you would do if you're doing, let's say, a document workflow. It's just another layer on top of the standard SharePoint workflow. So I'm just going to go to workflow approvals. And you're seeing here I've got a set of workflow tasks. Again, the same thing you would get if you're doing a multi-stage document workflow. And in this case, I'm just going to make it easy and say, great. I'm going to approve it. Again, you can define that. Is it another group in the IT organizations, typically someone with higher privileges or higher authority that's all configurable. Typically it's a group of admin. So we're just going to approve it. And if we just go back to the project center, let's go back to our project. Let's open that plan. And you see now we've moved into the selection phase. So we're in that third stage. What we need to do at this stage is, again, pretend that all of you in the room, let's say 80 people, you all submitted a request. Someone in IT validated all those requests, but now we get that steering committee saying, what are we going to do for the next quarter? Or what are we going to do for the next year? And how are we going to evaluate all the requests that each one of you submitted in the system? So that takes us to what Scott was mentioning is we're going to do a little analysis on all those requests and trying to evaluate them not only based on constraints that we might have, but also on capacity to have enough resources to execute on all those requests. So basically in Project Server 2010, you get a set of menus here on the left-hand side called Strategy. And that's where we got all that portfolio analytics that's all new in 2010. So let's just do a tech head simulation. And back to the question from the gentleman earlier, I can filter this by department if I really want to narrow down the set of drivers, if I want to only do a study or an analysis based on IT or whatever. In this case, I'm logged in as the administrator so I can see all the data. And another thing about Project 2010 is if I was part of, let's say, HR or IT, I will only see the things that I'm allowed to see. Meaning, if R&D is evaluating new products, they probably have a set of drivers or a set of projects that you shouldn't be looking at if you're in IT. So basically, I need to select all those inputs. And again, let's pretend all of you submitted something. So we've got a set of sample data to make this more realistic instead of me typing all those projects. And then you get an option. There's really two options when you do this exercise. Is you can just analyze a set of requests based on constraints, typically cost. And then what I just click is you also, it's not so much, do I have enough budget to do all those requests, but more importantly, do I have the capacity to execute on that laundry list of all the asks from all my business users. And that's what I did when I do time phase resource planning. So we just got to provide some attribute on how we're going to do that study. So again, I'm not going to go through all the detail. And let's just move forward to showing you an analysis of evaluating all those change requests we got within IT. So this view, you can see basically, pretend each one is one of those major projects. Somewhere we should have the SharePoint, SP1 right here in the middle. And then each column is the alignment of each request compared to those big bets, which say are those big drivers for IT, cost avoidance, employee retention, company gains, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a pivot on all the requests I get, and I can also chain in this UI. And you can already see in the sample data set, we modeled those different requests in the different stages in the lifecycle, and the automated software installation project or request hasn't been evaluated yet. So that's why it's all blank. So I just move forward. And basically, based on our answers, the impact we say that each project has based on all those drivers, the system calculates, based on that, it's got a set of formulas. It gives me what it thinks are the priority that I should be doing within my organization. But let's really skip to the next stage, where this is going to light up a little more. And what you're looking at, again, is if I had $1.4 million, I would be able to do all those big projects that get submitted in my organization. And that's what you're seeing that. You're seeing this list on this priority being calculated based on the response that I gave to each of those questions. But in real life, let's say I don't have 1.4 million. Let's just say I've got 500,000. And let's start recalculating. So we need to round trip that to the server, and then we kick in all those algorithms. And now you're looking at here, well, we had 20 requests initially. Well, we can only do 15 if we had about a third of the budget. And we can see that a bunch of projects that didn't make the cut in terms of aligning with our priorities, got moved out automatically by the system. Now, you might be wondering, okay, this is great, but I want to be in charge. Or maybe there's good reasons why we need to do the help desk ticket system integration. And it doesn't matter if it's being kicked out, if it's too expensive, we need to do that. So obviously in Project Server 2010, we can definitely model real-life situation, which is, I don't care what the system tells me, we need to do it. Maybe it's a compliance or regulatory project. It doesn't matter what the system thinks, or maybe it's a pet project. We need to do it. So you can absolutely start modeling those real-life scenarios in terms of forcing things in. And you see I forced it in. And it is an expensive $300,000 project. And sure enough, it kicked every project. Anyway, you get the idea. You start doing what-if scenarios. And then later on, you can compare them. And another way to look at all those requests is, which I think is very graphic, but what you're looking at this on this horizontal bar chart is, am I putting money where I say I should be investing, or are my drivers within IT? So again, typically organization, whether it's IT, whether it's new product R&D, new product development, or it doesn't matter what department, but typically, those don't change too often. Maybe you revise your set of drivers once a year. But it's always interesting to see, am I really investing where I say I should be investing in this next year? So let's just save this scenario. So this is the 500K with ticket system, with TS. And you can do a lot. You can go. Let me step back. You can do a lot more complex analysis, not just on a single criteria. In this case, it's cost, but it could be in risk, and you could do multi-value analysis. If evaluate project not just on cost, but let's say on risk or any other drivers that you're capturing in the request. So as I said in the overview on the portfolio, typically the next question you have is not so much to have the budget to fund those requests, but more importantly, to have the staffing, the capacity to execute on all those requests. And that's what you're seeing here. And we're actually not doing very good because out of all those requests we do have budget for, we can only do 2. And the reason is typical human nature is every time you ask someone or everyone submits a request, typically they want it yesterday, right? So you're seeing all those requests start at the same date. So typically there's 2 pivot. When you look at this, is either you model hiring headcount to manage that surge of requests, whether it's full-time equivalent or whether it's vendors, or the other angle to do the analysis is, Mr. Business User, can you wait for SP1 to go in, let's say, in September instead of July, so that my DBA, the quality assurance person, et cetera, are available to do all the testing, et cetera, et cetera. So let me just give you a peek. How do we know that? Remember when I modeled those FTE per month? The system has all that information. That's what you're seeing here with the surge. For instance, in this case, you see in red the developer. We're short on a developer in the month of May. But that's what the system tells you. So again, just make sure I've got enough time. So there's 2 analysis. Let's model headcount. And the system will figure out, oops, hang on. If I can edit. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, guys. So again, the first pivot is hire resources. And again, the system, there's no magic. It figures out what are the deficits. And here I've hired 4 resources, and I went from 2 to 4 projects being selected. And then the other modeling, move forward, is to change some of the start date. And maybe if we push this request in the future and recalculate, and you see it gets selected. So anyway, you get the idea that if you get a hiring freeze, you can start modeling those what if. And then I can save this scenario. And maybe, again, this is the 500K with 4 additional resource and whatever, a delay in, I can't remember which project it was. So you get the idea. Typically, at the end of this exercise, you would commit to this portfolio of projects. We brainstormed, we met with all the stakeholders, we figure out, can we get additional resources, additional funding, and you put a stake in the ground, say, this is as of January 1st, here's what we're going to do, at least for the next quarter, in terms of big projects, or for the next year. If I go back to the project center, again, it's the projects being selected. Let's say the SharePoint Service Pack 1. So we just need, from a workflow perspective, just to submit it, to kick it into the next stage. And at this stage, again, there's another level of approval that needs to happen. So I'll just forward. I'll go a little quicker here. Just do it. Okay, let's go back to the SP1 project. And you can see now I'm in the stage 4 execution. So typically in this stage, as I said, is I'm going to pass the baton this time to a project manager. Say, okay, you've been tasked to upgrade our farm to SP1. Let's start maybe substituting those generic resources with real people that I have on staff. I've got a budget. Maybe I need to provision additional hardware, et cetera, et cetera. And then so I build a plan. Typically, I would publish it. And then more importantly, then, once I've assigned real resources, people will start executing. One of the great thing in 2010 is because we integrate with Exchange, all the staff in my organization can start tracking, let's say on their favorite mobile device, progress. Let's say I'm traveling this week, and I can say, well, yeah, I've attended the SP1 overview talk, so I'm complete on this. I know what it contains, et cetera, et cetera. And as the project manager, I start getting all the feedback, and I can start seeing execution, and everything hopefully is trending to being 100% complete. One of the cool things in 2010 is you can start marking some of those tasks really directly in what we call the web app. So you can start directly doing some web-based editing. This, by the way, there's no ActiveX, so you can. There's no footprint when we ship updates to project server. So anyway, people start executing, et cetera, and it's forward ourselves in time, and it's pretend we're 100% complete. We've done the deployment test of SP1, and let's kick off the last stage, which is kind of like the post-mortem, the closure of this request that came in. So I'm just going to hit submit. Any questions while this is refreshing? Yes? So the question is, how do we handle dependencies between projects? There's a couple of ways to do that in Project Server 2010. There's what we call hard dependencies and soft dependencies. Yeah, it's pretty much the same thing. You can use master projects. You can use deliverables. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's new. You don't like either of them? But typically, those are the ones. And then, depending on the context, I've also seen folks that have built Visual Basic app directly in the desktop that manages those multi-project shifting and stuff like that. Another great thing in 2010 that's a little different than the prior version is we get this notion of manual scheduled tasks. And basically, it's telling the engine is, don't schedule that task. Do not touch it. Doesn't matter if something shifts. You're in control of what is the start date and end date. So I don't know if you've seen that, but maybe swing by the booth, and we'll show you that. But basically, the beauty is you're in charge of what happens to this task. So sometimes people like it because you can say, it's a milestone or a phase, and maybe things will shift, but that overarching bucket doesn't change. Now, whether you want to force a schedule change, you're in control pretty much. So that might help a little bit in managing inter-project dependencies. So again, I've hit submit, and now I'm in the last stage, and typically, again, very important step in the process, which is let's just close this, make sure everyone's happy, and maybe gather additional intel so that the next time we have, let's say, Service Pack 2, we can always go back and say whether we learn any and gather any additional efficiencies to gather similar requests in the future. So again, we just put a sample. Maybe I want to gather a rating. Maybe I get some feedback. Based on the business units, were you happy with the response time? Were you happy on how IT handled that request, et cetera, et cetera? So this is just an example. Maybe we should actually put it higher. Complete success, and maybe I want to start putting notes. Maybe I want to put in a document, a PowerPoint, whatever. It's as Scott mentioned. There's a project site that I haven't shown you that you can put a lot more all the document artifacts that could go with the lifecycle of such requests. So I'll just put great project, and again, because it's got that asterisk for those tasks, I wouldn't be able to submit it and actually go to the last stage of workflow until I've done those two things. So let's just save those two attributes that, again, I've just configured that in my workflow in 2010. And then you can see also that as the end user, I can also revisit, what did we gather initially? Maybe that was a 6-month project, and I don't remember. And notice how all those fields are read-only, right? Because you can't change what we agreed on at the beginning, but maybe it's something that matters to me. And same thing, what was the strategic impact that maybe Scott evaluated 6 months ago when we say we're going to commit to this request, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, this is just a glimpse into some of the capabilities we got in Project Server 2010 to model the life cycle of, in this case, a change request in a SharePoint form. And then the last thing, last thing I need to do is make sure I hit submit. And another way to know, where are we in the workflow is I do get visibility here if I want more details. You can see here I'm still waiting for input. And to really go to that last stage, meaning the project is done, complete, archive, et cetera, I just need to do that one last submit. And you can see now that the workflow has been completed, so I'm pretty much done with this request. On to the next one. So a couple things before I jump back to slides is obviously we're capturing all that data. Back to what Scott, when he was showing you the the wheel of what is the core capabilities of SharePoint 2010 on the one on project. Obviously, a great value of doing this is programmatically you're gathering all those data points, all those nuggets and jewels of how you're executing on projects, durations, effort, et cetera, quality, risk. And the beauty of that is obviously you can start surfacing all that information and potentially build dashboards. And you can see here this is the sample data that we shipped in the solution. It's just a sample data to make the story a little more real. But it could be thousands or hundreds of requests that your organization might be handling over a period of time. And this is just an example. In 2010, we're built on top of the SharePoint BI capabilities. But this is just an example. We do ship out of the box a Excel services template. On this case, it's just showing me a breakdown of how many projects I have by phases. And we got report, if you want to drill in, and that gives you for each request, when did they reach each stage in the process. Maybe I'm discovering that between initial business request and the selection, it's taking on average 3 months when maybe I've committed to a 60 days turnaround, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, there's a lot of data out there that it's just a matter of mining and surfacing so you can drive further efficiency within your organization, further transparency towards your business stakeholder and the organization. So that's, before I move back to the slides, any questions of what I just demoed? Yes, sir.
For the drivers, are they all equal or can the drivers be weighted?
Yeah. So the question is, for the drivers, are they all equal or are they weighted? And it's actually a very good question because they're definitely weighted. But they could be weighted equally. But basically, again, I wasn't planning to give you a thorough overview. There's plenty of white paper. But just to give you a glimpse, here we got a library of drivers. And back to the question from the other gentleman earlier, we can have drivers per department. So there's a set of drivers for IT, a set of drivers for finance, one set of drivers for R&D, and we got a set of all up contoso.com drivers. And so that's kind of the library. But where this gets interesting is driver prioritization. So we might do a prioritization for, let's say, 2011. We forward ourselves in time, and maybe in 2012, maybe we change a little bit. It's the same library, but the weighting is different based on sorry, let me go back. Based on the different changes in business condition that the company has. But we can just do a quick tech head driver, and we add the list here. There's really two things from a mathematical. Either you do the manual weighting, or what you're looking at is what we call pairwise comparison. So we evaluate each driver. So you go to this wizard that says cost avoidance, how does it compare to employee retention, et cetera, et cetera. And once I've done all the pairwise, at the end it's going to say, here's in theory how you think this. And typically the interesting thing is this alone typically generates a lot of value within an organization, because then you realize, do we all agree on what matters most, on how much weight each? And actually, to be honest, so I work in Redmond for the project team on the marketing side. The engineering team, that's how we decide what features are we putting in the next version of the product? And so, marketing, we come to the table, engineering comes to the table, and different stakeholders representing customers and partners, and we all agree. And typically, it could typically generates a lot of discussions and back and forth. But anyway, it gives transparency on, at the end of the day, you all agree on, cost avoidance. Is that a 10% weight in the decision? Is that a 5%? Is it 50%? Because, we got to do this one, et cetera, et cetera. So lengthy answer to say, yeah, you can do a pairwise comparison, or if you don't want any of that, you can manually enter the percentage. Okay? And again, typically you do that per set of drivers. So typically, you don't reinvent the rules of what's going to drive your organization, or hopefully every day. Typically, people do it once a quarter, once a year, and then you go on with it. Because obviously, you're evaluating the input against that. If the rule of how you're going to evaluate things keep changing, how are you going to decide what you're going to put in the next version of the product? Okay? And so there's links at the end of the deck. We got a great white paper that one of our MVP just recently wrote that talks about the mathematics behind some of that. Another question? Yes? So the question is, we mentioned it's a no-code solution. What's the licensing for this, if I understand correctly? And yeah, Project Server requires SharePoint Enterprise. So unless you've got the licenses for Project Server, then you need to, depending on your organization, depending on the contracts you get with Microsoft, then maybe one of the call to action is talk to your Microsoft rep or whoever's in purchasing, say, do I have the licenses for Project Server 2010? Maybe you get software assurance and you're entitled to this next version. I don't know, but yeah, you definitely Project Server is definitely something you need to license from us. No. So the question is, if you have SharePoint Enterprise Cal, can you use Project Server? No, it's additive to SharePoint, so it's a separate license. It's SharePoint Enterprise is required, but it's licensed separately. One more question, and then I'll wrap up. Yeah. So the question is, does the solution needs to be on the Project Server farm? Correct. And the answer is, okay, let me step back. Actually, I've got slides on describing what did we just show you and what did we ship. Because you'll see what we mean by solution. It's actually, what we're showing is, it's really a methodology. I mean, all this is out of the box. The only thing that's not out of the box is that visualization that I had, which is a standard WSP that we shipped a year ago when we RTM. So hopefully I'll answer your question in the next couple of slides. So let me just switch from the demo to the slides. Just look at the time. OK, we got a couple minutes. So what did we just see? What did I just demo just now? So Project Server, as we said, is, it provides a way to what we call demand management. Whether you're doing innovation process management, whether you're doing application lifecycle management, whether you're doing product lifecycle management, or whether you're managing farm change requests, we got a framework for that, from cradle to grave. We obviously have portfolio analytics, meaning I get that funnel of all those requests from everyone in the room, apples and oranges, and at the end I need to have a consistent way of evaluating those requests, not just based on cost or risk or ROI or whatever TCO, but more importantly, you do have the staff. And it's a great way for IT to say, maybe we need to do those 20 things, but I only have that much capacity. Maybe that's a great way to request headcount, right? Because you have a transparent way to say, here's all the estimate of all those requests, but I'm short on specific roles in my organization. So you see that third bullet is probably the one you're most familiar with, and I didn't show it, but once I've committed to this project, executing in a project plan, tracking progress, % complete, remaining work for my different resources. Obviously, we've done that for many versions. So what is the solution actually is? As Scott mentioned, really the first one is, I think the one that's the most valuable is the BDM, explaining, what is the issue and how you address that in your organization potentially, and what does this methodology, this approach brings to the table. So to further answer the questions is, in the install guide white paper, we've literally documented the business driver we used. We've documented those additional data points, like remember I use risk, estimated effort, risk, et cetera, et cetera. So we've documented that. So to answer your question is, if you don't want to restore the database and you want to actually key it in because maybe you want to switch a little bit the naming convention, we've documented that. Meaning if you have already a project server 2010 form and you just want to type it in, we've documented that. So meaning it's not a solution, it's more of a guide, right? You got to key it in. It might take, I don't know, half an hour or so, and then you're up and running. We've also provided a plan template, the one, again, as soon as each request, in 2010, you can map each request type to a different template. So meaning maybe a request of type, applying a software update is a specific project template with phases and milestones, and a request for, let's say, a new feature is a different template with a set of milestones. And then one thing I didn't show you also, we have in the solution a collaboration site template. There's not a lot in it, but really the illustration is you can tailor the methodology and the look and feel based on your methodology. And then we've documented what we call in the project server world lookup table and custom fields, which were those fields that were popping up, pardon me, when I was gathering data point, or like in the post-mortem when I was giving a score on the project. But if you don't want to rekey it in, and you just want to spin up an instance, so just to get a feel, or maybe demo it to some stakeholders you get in the at your organization, we did ship 5 databases, and then you can just do a 5 DB attach on a test instance, right? Don't do that in production. And then you'll get that data set. That's exactly what I just showed you. So again, it's just sample data to illustrate the point. It might not fit the exact same need, or it might not resonate in your organization, but the point is we put a little bit of data so you can do a portfolio analysis on more than just one request. But that's the last option. So again, to answer your question, what does the solution contains? White paper is really the key thing. The first option that we've described in the install guide, you have 2 options to light this up. You key in the data manually, and we've documented all the data you need. So it's really a configuration. Or you want to just be a little quicker. You do a 5 DB attach on a test environment, and you get that same data set that I just showed you. OK, now there's 2 things that we did use to really light up the solution is those 2 solution starters that we shipped a year ago when we shipped Project Server 2010 alongside with the whole Office 2010 wave. Is the dynamic workflow solution. I didn't show you that. Again, it's documented in the install guide. And basically, to light up that 5-stage workflow, we didn't want to use any code. We didn't want to create a workflow using Visual Studio. So we used this graphical tool which uses InfoPath to create those stages and the approvals, et cetera, et cetera. And then because we really light up the data, we also use this other solution that's out there on MSDN code gallery called the workflow visualization web part. OK, so in summary, as Scott mentioned, you do have, looks like everyone raised their hand when we asked, how many of you have managing farms or are handling change requests. And hopefully, I think you're probably getting more and more as the solution is becoming adopted by more and more business units. And what we're providing you is, a method, a tool to manage those requests within your organization by leveraging Project Server 2010. So just a couple of next steps is, look at the maturity model. Like Scott mentioned, you do need a little bit of process to really start lighting up or leveraging these capabilities. But once you've at that stage, then download the white paper, download the solution, look at it, test it. If you're not familiar with Project Server 2010, some of the concepts or some of those new capabilities that I just showed you, especially around the analytics, again, we got great assets out there. Maybe engage a partner or get trained. There's plenty of content, books, et cetera, out there to start leveraging that. A couple more things I want to do before we wrap up is a couple other sessions at TechEd. There's one tomorrow from Brian Smith that talks about more like troubleshooting. So it's more of a DDAV IT pro, typically targeted at those of you that are already familiar with Project Server. And then tomorrow I'm wrapping up the day doing this time a different topic, but it's got some similarities, which is how do I manage application with Project Server connected to Team Foundation Server. So that's the end of the day tomorrow. And then we also have 2 hands-on lab. If you want to practice the portfolio analytics that I just showed you, you got a lab here at TechEd. And more importantly, you can also download the demo VM. And we got all those links. If you look at the very last slide of this deck, which is available as of now. And in the booth, feel free to stop by if you got further questions. One quick announcement. We did announce recently that we will have a project conference in about a year from now in Phoenix in mid-March. So definitely start thinking about it, or maybe telling your managers that they should start putting a budget aside for you to attend. And a couple of resources, and more importantly, please fill in an evaluation. It's really important. Not just the scores, but more importantly, the comments. Does this story resonate? What can we do to improve? What didn't you like, et cetera, et cetera. So we really pay attention to those. And that's about it. So thank you very much for your time.